Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined this episode by Neal Shusterman, author of Game Changer. This young adult sci-fi novel follows Ash, a pretty average middle-class kid with few ambitions beyond winning football games and hanging out with his friends. That all changes when a hard hit on the football field alters Ash's world, but in a way only he seems to notice. Suddenly all the stop signs are blue, and to his rising anxiety, nobody thinks that's weird or even remembers them being red. Another game, another impact, and Ash's world shifts more dramatically. Now he drives a fancy car, his parents have money, his difficult brother has a good relationship with him. But in this new version of the world, he also has made some terrible and dangerous choices, ones that affect his friends, his community, and his safety. With each dimensional transition, Ash sees his life and perspectives alter more radically. In every world that is almost but not quite his own, he is challenged by his shortcomings and the ways he has let down those he loves most. Ash will need to harness his dimension-hopping ability swiftly, or risk letting his true life vanish entirely from existence. Game Changer is introspective and propulsive YA Sci-Fi, published by Quill Tree Books, and is available now. And Neal, welcome to Fictitious.
Thank you very much.
So if you will indulge me for a moment, I have a short Neal Shusterman story. So I've been doing this show for probably like 4 years or so. I did another podcast long before this. I've done author things and stuff for years at Comic-Cons and whatever. But while this is our first meeting, you were actually the very first author I ever interacted with as a reader. And this goes all the way back to, I believe, the spring of 1999, because I was working in a bookstore at that time while I was in college, and a book that passed through my hands there that was called Scorpion Shards. And it had this kind of goofy middle grade cover, but I remember reading the blurb and thinking, this doesn't sound like middle grade. Why is this being marketed this way? And so I ended up reading that story. And at the back of it, there was the regular author blurb, but it included your email address. And that was the first time I had ever seen an author's email address or any kind of digital contact included in a book. And I emailed you, and you emailed me back really quickly and, sent me like a nice message and answered a couple of questions I had about the story and kind of where you were going with it with the rest of that series. And that always stuck with me, that like in the year of our Lord 1999, I was able to reach out digitally to an author and talk with them about their book, which felt very novel and very, very progressive in that particular moment. Now, flash forward 2021, and we were here in the age of the future, talking to each other digitally on cameras and stuff. It was fun for me to finally make this small reconnection with you all those years afterwards. And I've always appreciated that you have been very available to your readership. I gave my description of this story at the top. This is a layered thematic story in a lot of ways. What is your elevator pitch for it? How do you talk about it?
Well, Game Changer is a story about empathy and about learning empathy. The main character, Ash, he's this fairly oblivious white heterosexual male, but in the course of the story, he's going to have all of his notions of the world and of himself challenged. He's going to have this crash course in racism, homophobia, sexism, and privilege through these world-changing events that are going to hit him harder than he hits on the field.
I think that when this book might initially enter people's awareness. And I would say that like there is a big fandom for your books. I mean, if people notice that, the Scythe woodcut behind you, a very, very popular novel, you are a very prolific novelist and writer. Like I said, I was first encountering your work back in the late 90s. You're known for sci-fi and fantasy kinds of stuff, but I think this particular piece may be a little different from what people might be normally expecting from you. And I will say, like, if somebody is saying, oh, okay, like, Neal is approaching something as kind of some people will refer to it like a message piece or something like that. Like I said, I first read your work with Scorpion Shards, and there were lots of progressive ideas and looks at empathy and examining people from different backgrounds. And that was reading a book that was, at that point aimed at a young adult, middle grade kind of audience felt very progressive in its moment then. Thinking about the themes of this story that I really want to dig into in a bit, who's kind of the primary intended audience? Like, who are you most looking to hit with this novel?
Well, the easy answer is everybody. I'm always trying to write stories that will reach the largest audience, that's starting with teens and all the way through, adults of any age. But particularly, I want this story to reach those suburban kids with limited perspectives on the world. And I really want to try to increase that perspective. The character of Ash is, like I said, this white heterosexual male, but I want to be able to take that and sort of flip this whole trope of, the white male hero trope, and make it not about that, but make it about that character learning that he is not the hero that he thought he was, realizing that the world has to be saved because of him, because of his inaction and actions that he's done. So it's really about learning personal and social responsibility, growing into accountability, which is something that everyone needs to do. And I'm hoping that this will model, positive behavior towards that.
I think in an era where, particularly with social media, the internet, and with a lot of the upheaval that we've gone through socially over the last decade or so, I think young people in general have been, a lot of young people, I should say, have been faced with more of the social imbalances and hopefully recognizing some of those changes. But I think it can be very easily, as a kid, to be very isolated from them and insulated. I mean, I know growing up as a straight white kid in the Midwest, in a rural town, that there were a lot of those things that just, I just couldn't see. I mean, it was like well beyond my ability to see them and approach them until later on when I got into college and met a lot of people who were different than me. In this novel, you're taking aim at a lot of different things. It's not focused on a singular type of problem. I mean, other than perhaps lack of perspective and lack of empathy is maybe the biggest encompassing problem. But Ash has got to face the systemic and casual racism that his best friend faces. He has to look at the sexism that the women in his life face. He has to look at a lot of these challenges that face the gay community and just a lot of other people in his world, all these things that he has been insulated from for so long. When you started working on this story, thematically, were all those things already there? Were you already like, okay, this is what I'm setting out to write about, and I have found a science fiction mechanic to approach those things? Or did it go from a different direction? How did that evolve? Like, how did the story come together?
Well, once I decided that I wanted to write it, I mean, that was the reason that I wanted to write it, was because it was going to approach all of these different issues. And, it's not really about a lack of empathy, as it is more about an absence of it. And I think, there's a difference. He's not a non-empathetic kid. He just doesn't know what empathy he's lacking. So it's sort of opening that up and allowing him to find that empathy. Now, when I first started writing it, I knew that I wanted to hit some very specific issues. I wanted him to see the world through a whole lot of different perspectives. I tried to give him a glimpse of different things. I didn't want to do a single deep dive into any one issue. I mean, I don't feel that's my place to do. I felt that the best that I could do for this character was to show him a little bit from different points of view, with his personal understanding that he is going to grow and take those deep dives himself.
Yeah, I think in a way, when you get into something, a story where it's trying to approach those big concepts, you either have to go all in on one thing or do what I think and hopefully this isn't too reductive, but it almost feels like a primer, like an empathy primer.
Exactly.
And yeah, it can be a very tricky thing as an author, I think, in an era where we are trying as much as possible to create avenues to change and create avenues towards greater understanding. There is also always going to be criticism of whether or not you were the right person to say it, or if you did it exactly right that moment. And of course, it can't be right for every single person. It is a different strokes for different folks kind of world. So that is always a challenge in a big way, and one that I think can be a tightrope in a lot of ways. Something we talk about in the show a lot is trope, because it has become more commonplace in the vernacular of the audience, in criticism, in marketing, in just the world of science fiction and fantasy and genre fiction in general. Were you conscious of any particular tropes? I mean, I guess multi-dimensional stuff is a trope in and of itself. But when you were constructing this story, were there any in particular that you were thinking about or realized had risen up in the narrative?
Well, my writing is generally all about looking at tropes and shattering them. So I'm always trying to deconstruct the trope and look at it in a new way. So as I was saying, like the trope of the hero, now it's the hero finding out that he's not a hero. One of the tropes that I really wanted to address was abuse. And I go into a whole discussion, or Ash does, when he's female, when it's Ashley, where she talks about the fact that when we see abuse on TV, it's always easy to pick out. We can always tell who the abuser is. It's not always that easy, because abusers can be psychological, emotional abusers, and it's very, very insidious how they can trap women in relationships. And I wanted to sort of take that trope and sort of toss it around so that hopefully people can see that it's not so simple in terms of avoiding that kind of relationship. You know, in our society, when we see TV shows or movies where it's very obvious who the abuser is, people think, oh, well, that's never going to happen to me because I'm so much smarter. Well, it's much darker than that and much more insidious. And my hope is that, the girls and women who read it will look at it and say, that's something that maybe I'm caught in this relationship, or I need to avoid that kind of relationship. So there's a lot of tropes throughout the story that I'm trying to turn around, and a lot of insight that I'm trying to give through this character. Now, I can't tell a story from a woman's perspective. I can't tell a story, from a person of color's perspective. The story that I can tell, that I have the authority to tell, is from the perspective of this white suburban, cisgender male. So really the best that I can do is to take that character and have him see the world from all of these different other people's perspectives.
Thinking about perspective there, one of the things that is a core discussion point on this show is world building, and particularly when you look at science fiction and fantasy. And this particular instance, we start out in basically what amounts to our world, or at least the Ash's tiny corner of it, and then you see that world change multiple times. But I was struck when I was thinking about it that the world building of this novel seemed less about the bigger environment and setting, but much more about the world building was about Ash's perspective. Because I think the first chapters of the novel really go hard on developing out how Ash views his rather mundane world. This is not going to feel very unfamiliar to a lot of people that are, growing up in small towns or middle-sized towns or going to an average high school. Nothing is very out of place or unusual. So it's all extremely familiar. But what we're spending our time doing is learning what it means to be Ash, because the rest of the novel is finding out what it means to be different versions of Ash and the ramifications of that. So approaching it from that way, I mean, I don't know if that was ever a conscious thing in your mind, thinking about it that way, that Ash is almost the world, or at least the sort of the center of the universe of this story. So as you're exploring that, like structurally and developmentally, how do you go about like centering a character who's rather a mundane kid, and then building him out into something much larger through those experiences?
Well, when you're telling a first-person story, your character basically is the center of their universe, and you can only see things through that character's eyes. Structurally, I decided that I wanted to tell it sort of as a retrospective, in the sense that he's been through this, and he's telling his experience. He's explaining the experience that he'd been through, and it was very important to me that there's a whole idea of show versus tell. When you're telling a first-person story, it appears to be a lot of telling. I wanted to make sure that what I was doing was I was showing his experiences and then having him reflect on them. So the pattern was show what happened and then reflect on what it meant. That was sort of how I built the story. And yeah, he is supposed to be an ordinary kid. He has, he has a sense of humor. He has a personality. But for all intents and purposes, he's just, your ordinary high schooler. And I want every kid to be able to relate to him on some level.
I think, when you've got a first person POV, there's kind of two different ways to approach it. You could either be in the moment with the character where they have no idea what's coming next and you're sort of experiencing along with them, or you get the retrospective version where they've already experienced it and they're relaying it as a narrative. And so that changes the flavor of how they express themselves, how they talk about stuff. With this, I mean, you get a sense that that Ash is talking about himself as he was before he's gone through these experiences. And he has, I don't want to say a more jaundiced view of himself, but he certainly has a frustrated view of himself because he's now, more aware of what he was lacking or the mistakes he was making. When you were starting to write this, is that a conscious choice that you had to make, decide between being in the moment or in that retrospective kind of delivery of the POV? Or was it something that just came naturally as you were just writing the story?
It was a choice. I could have told it first person present or first person past in the way that he does not have, he's not looking back on it. But I realized that we don't want to see that character. I mean, the character who is experiencing it while it's happening doesn't have the ability to reflect on it. And I think the reflection is a really important part of the story. And so by starting it off with this whole sort of preamble of, you're not going to believe me. You're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you, but it had happened. Starting with that really allows the character to both go through the story and bring the reader through the story with him, but at the same time, have those moments where he can break the fourth wall and say, this is what I was like then, but this is what I've learned. This is how I've come to see it. And I think, that's a really important part of the story. There's that moment where he talks at, a critical part of the story, he talks about our own perspectives on ourselves. He talks about the idea that a red blood cell has no idea that it is part of a larger organism. And we are like those blood cells. We are part of something so much larger than ourselves that we can never comprehend. And, that is an important revelation for him and something that is, I think, important to bring to the audience and bring to readers.
Something that in examining your work and looking at the fan base for it, something that I think has become a hallmark of your writing is that there is a propulsive, compulsive sense of momentum in your stories. When people talk about books they can't put down or the books that they fly through because it never flags, it never loses its energy, that seems to be kind of a hallmark of your work. When approaching pacing, when you're constructing a story, thinking about the shape of the narrative, the flow of it, how you're giving these information, and like you said, I mean, you're kind of balancing that telling versus showing as far as giving us the look at Ash's world and his experience, and then also kind of giving a running commentary alongside of it. What was your approach to pacing? What were the places where you needed to kind of patch it up and make sure that it was moving quickly? And from a constructive standpoint, what is your methodology for managing that?
Well, I'm a very impatient writer. Life is too short to write something boring, and I don't have the patience for it. If something starts to get boring, if I start to bog down in the story, I figure out what to do to make myself excited about it again. And so I'm always trying to figure out how to move the story along, how to move the plot along, how to move the growth of the characters along. And it is, just a basic part of my process that I'm trying to dispense with as much pedestrian stuff as possible and dispense with the things that aren't interesting to read or write. I mean, there is a lot of connective tissue that you need in a story, but that doesn't mean that the connective tissue can't be exciting in and of itself.
That's a very good point. And I like that you bring that up because I think sometimes I've seen writers who get lost in the mundane stuff and then it gets really bogged down because they feel like they have to give us every little piece of stuff, and a lot of which we can intuit on our own. There's a common refrain on this show. I say I like to work. I like having something in a story that I need to chew on and consider a little bit, and that I can do a little background work, where I get small epiphanies of oh, okay, I see where that's going. I like some of that to be in the background so it doesn't bog down the narrative. So yeah, I like that you mentioned all that. With Ash, I mean, we've talked a lot about him here, and I try to not be spoiler heavy on this show because, I mean, this is a show about craft, but at the same time, a lot of times this will be a lot of people's introduction to the story. But I think that it's also important to kind of note some of the things that happen here as a way of understanding where things really turn around. Because, you know, when I mentioned in the opening that the first thing that changes for Ash, he takes that first hit, and then the next day, you know, stop signs are blue. Like, he runs a stop sign because he just doesn't see the red of it, and his brain doesn't register it. And that is a big thing to have changed, but also relatively small in the grand scope of a person's life. And I think for a lot of us, at least I have had those kinds of moments where I feel like, especially growing up, where there would be a moment where it felt like something I understood about the world one day wasn't what I understood the next day, and it left me with this sense of surreality that I just kind of got adjusted to. Ash has to face that of like, okay, they're just blue and everybody says they're blue. There's something wrong with me, I guess, and I'm just having to course correct. But like you were saying, as far as like, you know, not getting boring, the next shift is much bigger for him in the sense that his entire family life changes. His parents' history changes. So then now they're suddenly wealthy. He's got a fancy car. His relationship with his brother is great when it wasn't before. But then we discover, as Ash discovers, that he also is essentially a drug dealer in this world. And he has taken advantage of some other relationships in his life in unhealthy ways he would have never done in the other one. So I'm curious, like, what were you thinking as far as making some of those big shifts, you know, making Ash face those enormous changes? And, you know, what are Ash's motivations going on other than just trying to figure out how to deal with these radical changes to his life?
Well, when I started shifting the world, it was kind of like stepping into a cold pool. I wanted Ash to get his feet wet a little bit and sort of get a sense of the changes, and then each change became bigger and more encompassing. With the first one, the blue stop signs, that really came from his discussion about, you know, color shouldn't matter when talking about race. And I sort of wanted that to begin, just the beginnings to resonate. Well, you know, color shouldn't matter. But the problem is, in our world, it does. In a perfect world, color shouldn't, but we're not in a perfect world. And privilege is basically the gap between shouldn't and doesn't. Dealing with the color of stop signs was just a hint at what's coming, but just had him start to realize that, yeah, you know, color does matter in small ways, and as it works its way up to something much bigger. Now, in the world where he is rich, I was also trying to flip a trope there. That whole, you know, Back to the Future kind of trope where, oh, you know, in this alternate universe, I get everything that I want. I'm the rich kid. Yeah, but you know what? You're a rich kid and you're a creep because you're dealing drugs. Now come to terms with who you are once you are this rich kid. Because one of the rules of the story is he has all the memories from his original world, but he also has all of the memories from the world that he has gone into. So he can see who he was in this world as well, in this new world. And he doesn't like who he is. He does not like this rich version of himself. And in each of these worlds, he's faced with not just a whole different world, but different versions of himself that he has to reconcile. I
think that a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, especially stuff that leans towards younger readers, has big elements of wish fulfillment in them. I think a lot of the classic core stuff that we've grown up with have that. I think what we see here is a twist on that when you talk about the wish fulfillment of like waking up one day and like you said, like it's Marty McFly and suddenly, you know, everybody's wealthy and everything's great. But you see there's a consequence to that, and dealing with the fact that like, oh, if maybe some of my other troubles weren't there, in the absence of those, I might have become a different person, and maybe not one I didn't like, and then trying to reconcile with that. I think that's an interesting place for the story to go, and definitely at least for me, was something where I had to stop and think about, like, what would that have been like for me? Where were the sliding doors moments in my own life where I could have gone a couple of different ways, and what those choices would have meant. So I think in a lot of ways, Ash does operate as sort of like an avatar for the reader, where they can see themselves in those moments, and ask that same question, or like, well, who would I have been in that, and how would I deal with that if I experienced that same thing, which I think is pretty effective. It's worth, I mean, noting, I think, that anytime, again, you've got a story dealing with these kinds of big themes, and you have a main character who is, as you said, cisgender white kid, pretty garden variety, because I always refer to myself as a fairly authorette garden variety white guy, but kind of kid. You're going to get people who are going to see these things, and they're going to use the term white savior, because they're going to think, oh, here's a kid, it's the white kid at the center of a story that's kind of about other people's stuff. And I only bring that up because I feel like it's almost unavoidable in the current discussion, like in the social discussion. In thinking about Ash, thinking about the character and what you're trying to accomplish here, I mean, the book itself addresses this head on towards the end of it. But I'd be curious, like, how you think about that, how you address that, maybe if that was even an editorial conversation with the publisher, stuff like that. Like, what is your thinking about that as a commentary, and how do you respond to it?
Well, it was a big editorial discussion, and it was in my mind from the very beginning. It's an easy knee-jerk reaction to come to that, white savior kind of thought with the story. But that's not the story that I wrote. As I said, I wrote the story about a character who is discovering that he is not the white savior. And that was the entire point from the very beginning. I mean, that was the thrust of what I was trying to do. There's always going to be people who have that reaction. And there's also going to be people on the other side. There's people who on the extreme right have said that this story is too much, social justice. So you're not going to please everybody. And, the best that you can do is to tell the best possible story that you can, and be conscious of what you're trying to do, and make sure that you do everything you can to be authentic. I mean, I spoke with so many people from so many different walks of life to really make sure that the story was hitting home and was respectful, and really said what needed to be said in a story like this. And it's out there, and I think people will judge it for themselves.
And certainly everybody is bringing their own experience to a book like this. And there are some people who have experienced those issues firsthand and know them very well, who might, go into something like this and be like, well, I don't need to be told about that because I live it. And that's understandable. I mean, that is their lived experience, but certainly that is not universal. And as we've seen all the time, there is a push and pull in society, towards one way or the other, of like accepting ideas of social justice, living them or rejecting them, and trying to find that spot where somebody who maybe has not fully embraced some of those ideas, or found them approachable in a way that makes sense to them, is important. Not every book is for everybody, and everybody's at a different place in their life to see those kinds of messages. So I like how you addressed it there. We haven't talked a lot about the other characters in this novel. We've really focused on Ash, and Ash is, I mean, like you said, sort of the center of his own universe in this thing. But it's a relatively small cast of characters that are revolving around him, and that he's seeing it from a different perspective. It's like, if you just think about the dimension shifting around him each time, and offering him new ways to explore those relationships. But he has his friend Leo, his best friend Leo, who is black, and so has a different experience of the world than he does, and one that Ash does not always understand in a real way, even though he kind of, I don't want to say that Ash thinks of himself as woke, but he doesn't perceive his own blindness. And you hit on that kind of earlier, that he doesn't know what he doesn't know until he his world gets poked a few times, and he recognizes them. There's a girl named Katie who ends up being his sort of confidant, the one person he's like, hey, my world's super screwed up and things are going weird. And she's the one person who's kind of listening to him and recognizing that maybe everything isn't quite right and normal. His brother, he has this interesting shifting dynamic and change and family dynamic and relationship with. So I'm just curious, if you can kind of give us an overview of these different characters, what roles they play, without giving too much away of the story, where we see those things shift. What should readers be expecting, and how did those shifts reflect the themes that you were trying to approach?
It's very hard to talk about the story without giving spoilers, so I'm not even going to try. So there will be spoilers. There will be spoilers. Ash's best friend is Leo, who's black, and Leo is always on Ash's case about just not getting it. And Ash doesn't know what he's not getting. He doesn't have the perspective to know what he's missing. One of my favorite parts in the story is when Ash talks about when they went out protesting and they were on a street corner holding up signs and people were honking their support, against institutional racism. And Leo got angry. And Ash couldn't understand why Leo was angry. And Leo said, because honk if you hate racism doesn't do anything. Basically, people can honk their horn in support and then drive off, and they think that they've done what they need to do. Their conscience is clear. They're guilt-free because they honk. That's not the solution. Ash was that kind of person who thought he could do something or make himself feel better and convince himself he's not racist, and that's all he needed to do. Now he realized that the problem's a lot bigger than that, and there's a lot more that needs to be done and that individuals can do. Now, there's the character of Katie, who is in a relationship with Leighton, the quarterback of the football team. And we suspect and we start to find out that it's an abusive relationship, not physically abusive, but emotionally and psychologically. And later in the story, when Ash becomes Ashley and she's a woman, she's the one in the relationship with Leighton and gets to see firsthand and gets to understand firsthand what it's like to be caught in that relationship. And there's a moment where the world is exactly the same as it was previously, but he's the one who's changed. And he is now gay. And he has to, for the first time, understand what that feels like. He has a secret relationship with one of his friends. He's been closeted and has been afraid to come out. In the course of the story, he does come out. And so now there's this version of Ash. And you know what? He realizes that he likes this version better than his original version. How is he going to put this all together when he gets everything back to where it started? Because ultimately, he discovers that the best that he can ever hope to do, he can't save the world. He can't fix the world. That's not his place. The best that he can do is to bring things to a place to start. That's what he learns through the course of the story, through all of these different perspectives.
There's an additional set of characters that I'm when I always go out and read reviews and Goodreads and stuff going into these interviews because I like to see other perspectives. I like to examine things from angles that I maybe wouldn't see. But one thing I saw a lot of was people really like the twins and these a couple of characters that are floating through Ash's various different realities. What can you tell us about who those characters are and what they mean to Ash and his newfound ability in swapping universes?
The Edwards. They were my tweak on the trope of the character who comes in and knows all and explains all. They are, first, in the first world that he jumps to, there's one kid, it's kind of like the skater dude. But in the next one, there's two of them. They're twins. In the next one, there's three of them. And finally, he realized that this is a pattern, and he finally confronts them when there's three of them. And they are basically this multi-dimensional being that keeps becoming, adding a new one in each world that he jumps to. And they're all the same being, but they are from the different worlds. And they end up bickering with each other. They don't agree as to how to deal with the problem. Their job is to help the person who is this temporary world changer to bring things back to where it started before the universe decides that it's gone too far and destroys the entire planet.
When I was reading, I was thinking with them that with the Edwards that I was like, they were this combination for me of, like you said, the person that the protagonist can go talk to, like the one person who knows some stuff about what's going on, which is definitely tropish and necessary in a lot of ways. You have to have somebody they can have that conversation with, but they almost operate to me like a Greek chorus. The more of them they are, the way that they are reacting to, responding, and like you said, the kind of bickering amongst themselves, where like there is that sort of Greek chorus kind of thing of them kind of highlighting the things that Ash is going through and some of the errors there too, which I liked a lot. I want to get into the nitty-gritty of your writing process here, and I think it is again worth noting that you have been writing for page and screen for several decades now. I think like right out of college or high school, right? Like, I mean, you
right out of college.
Yeah. So, and you've been highly prolific. For you now, what does the writing process look like? Are you an outliner? Are you like a discovery writer or pantser, or some combination of the two? What does that look like for you as you approach each story?
It's a combination of both. I like to plan the story. So I at least that I know that I have a story. I have a destination and a rough route of how to get there. But in the course of the story, it all goes out the window every single time. I mean, the characters will start to do things I wasn't expecting. I'll come up with better ideas than what I have that take the story in a different direction. Ultimately, what I've done is I've tricked myself into thinking that I know where the story's going to help get me started. But the story starts taking on all of these different directions I wasn't expecting. It's like a mountain road. You know where you're going to, you know your ultimate destination, but the winding path to get there is never what you predicted that it's going to be. So it's a combination of both plotting and pantsing, I say.
And is there any kind of plotting method that you adhere to? I mean, there's your classic 3-act structure, 4-act structure. There's more frameworks and things that have come out over the last couple of decades, whether they're like a Save the Cat or a 7-point structure. Any of those kinds of things. Have you used those? Have you flirted with any of those as your technique, your own? What does that look like for you?
For writing for film and TV, that 3-act structure is pretty solid, particularly for film. So yeah, you sort of have to write within that structure. When it comes to books, like I said, I'm always about breaking the rules. I mean, if someone tells me this is how you tell a story, my instinct is to, oh yeah, well, I want to tell it this other way instead. I want to be contrary. And so I'm always trying to break those tropes and the rules. If there's a rule that said this is how you must do it, I'm going to do the opposite. I guess it's just my nature. When it comes to plotting the story, I tend to really try to focus on the characters and developing the characters, because, you can take characters that you believe in so many different directions, but it all comes down to believing who that character is. And if you care about that character and that character responds to the world like a real human being, you can have the most fantastical journey with them and you'll go along with it because you believe the character. But the second you stop believing that character, the second it starts to feel like it's all about the plot and it's all about the setting and it's not about a person, then you lose the readers, then you lose the audience.
Tools of the trade wise, what do you write in? What are your, what's your software? Do you do any analog things? What's your approach to that?
I actually write my first drafts longhand. And lately I've been using a fountain pen. I think I'm going backwards technologically. Next will be a quill, I guess. But I've always written longhand, and there's multiple reasons why I do that. First of all, once you sit at the computer and start writing, it feels much more permanent, and you can get lazy. You don't do as much revision. By sitting in front of the computer, sometimes I feel like I'm there all the time. But if I start to write longhand, it gets me away from the computer. It allows me to do a rewrite as I'm typing it in. And that's really the biggest reason why I do it. I know I'm going to get lazy. If I start on the computer, I'm not going to put as much effort into that revision. But if I write it out longhand, since I'm the only one who can read my handwriting, I'm the one who has to type it in. And I'm revising it as I'm typing it. I'll do that chapter at a time. I'll write a chapter, I'll type it in, I'll revise it, and then get on to the next chapter. And it creates a sense of variety. I'll also dictate. Sometimes I just don't feel like writing and I don't feel like sitting at the computer. So I'll take my iPhone and I'll just start dictating, and then I'll transcribe that. And I always want to do the transcription myself because that's an important part of the process of revision is entering it into the computer. And also I love that sense of connection between hand and pen and brain. It's just, just writing feels good. And I like doing that.
I think there's something to be said for the fact that when you're writing longhand too, there's an innate need to forgive the mistakes in that first draft because there's no good way to revise them in that format. Whether it's like, you write a page and then reread it and realize you used the same descriptive word 3 times in a paragraph or something like that. Those kinds of things for me, like me writing on the computer, I have like almost inability to edit as I go. Like I have a compulsive need to fix those problems right there from the beginning rather than just pushing through and getting something in. And that can really grind me to a halt sometimes versus handwriting where you can't do that. I mean, you could go through and scribble something out and write something in the margin, but then your page looks like a disaster. And if you're in any way OCD, that's just ugly and frustrating. But But yeah, so you kind of have to just have that experience of getting it down. There's also, I mean, holding a book is great. Having a physical manifestation of a story is a powerful, wonderful thing. Having your own book full of a handwritten narrative, there's something charming about it. There's something powerful about it. I don't know that it works that way for everybody, but like my notebooks full of my own stuff are some of my more precious possessions. I got to think, if you've got a notebook that is just the first draft of the very first nascent beginning of something, there's something really cool about that you can't have with a digital first draft or just a printout, that there's like an artifact in time of the original version of something. Maybe it's one of those things that, it'll end up in a museum someday, but I just think those things are very cool. As I've said, I mean, you have been on the scene a long time. You have a tremendous number of books out. You have a lot of awards. Clearly, again, referencing the Scythe background there. I mean, that was a big hit, that series, and had a big impact in the YA world. Where should people be following you online so they can get caught up with your back catalog if they're new to you, to see what things are coming out next, to just kind of get the Neal Shusterman experience and see where you're going next with your writing?
Well, my website is storyman.com, and that's a great place to go to see what's new. Also, on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, I do a lot of social media, so just easy to find, just Neal Shusterman. And I'm always connecting with my fans in one way or another. Most of my characters are named after fans, mostly in Twitter and Facebook. So I'm always trying to find interesting ways of connecting with the readers, all the way back to when I had my email address that you found in Scorpion Shards. That was really kind of the beginning of that, when people really had immediate access to authors. And I've tried to keep that up to this day, trying to really be connected with the audience.
Funny, you circle back to that. When I reached out to you back in the day, one of the things that I was emailing you about was when I read Scorpion Shards, I had been just casually kind of screwing around with my own story while I was in college about these 6 kids with these interconnected abilities and stuff. And so when I read the premise of that, I was like, oh no, that sounds very similar to what I'm working on. And I read the novel, and there were a lot of similarities. I mean, obviously yours was done in the world and well constructed, and mine never surfaced in any way. But I had basically emailed you saying, like, what do I do in this instance when I've got something where I feel like, oh, this has already been done, how do I pivot? And you had given me the advice, and again, this is over 20 years ago, but something to the effect of every story can be unique, and even if there are parts of the premise that are similar to one another, you just have to find that next iteration, that next change of detail, that thing that feels honest to the story and changes it up. And so what I did afterwards, I was like, okay, I'm going to strip down this concept that I originally had that felt too close to it. And the next thing I decided to do was like, what's something I've never looked into that I've been kind of scared to even touch on that maybe I can use to evolve this story? And I went to tarot. I went to start exploring like concepts of tarot. And then while I was doing that, like getting the stuff at that bookstore, the next novel came out in the series with And then tarot played a big part in that second book, and I was like, "Oh, Shusterman did it to me again." But
it was in the zeitgeist. We're all connected one way or another.
Right, exactly. And funnily enough, the universe was telling me something, because at that bookstore that I worked at, I bought this like packaged book collection that was a tarot deck and book that was supposed to be like sort of the introduction to tarot. And I was like, all right, I'm going to take this in and I'm going to learn what this is, and I'm going to put this in my story. And I got it open and I peeled the plastic off and I took the gift set apart, and the book was blank and the cards were blank. I literally got an entirely blank set, which should have told me everything that I needed to know. It was not meant to be.
Or you were to create your own set of tarot cards.
I didn't even take it back. I was so amused by the entire thing that I was like, you know what, I'm going to keep these because it's a reminder to just fill in my own story and do my own thing. So, yeah.
But for me, it's Neil Gaiman. I write something and I'm working on something. Neil Gaiman does it right before I finish it. It's like consistent. it's. So I'm just giving. I know if I have an idea, Neil Gaiman came up with that idea like 3 months before I did.
it is so weird how that stuff happens, how it's in the zeitgeist, how whether if you're coming from similar influences or see the world in a similar way. I had that problem also with the show Supernatural, where like there were things I was working on and it would like Supernatural beat me to the punch like every time, where it'd be like, oh, here's the thing I'm gonna do, and then Kripke and his team would do that same story. And there were times where I'd be sitting in my living room watching it with my wife, and she would know things I was working on or stories that, and I mean, I am a very undisciplined writer, and I have so many things that are sitting in the drawer need to be pulled out. But I would have told her things I was working on, and an episode would start, and she would just turn and look at me to see my reaction as I was just, as I watched another one of those things like kind of flitter away that I didn't get to first, which is the reminder that like if you've got a story and you've got a thing to tell, you got to get out, because the other people will get there if you don't. And there are always other variations. There's other ways to approach them. But yes, it's fun for me to have shared that with you all these years later, and how funny that was in the moment, where I had to laugh at my own predicament and just how those things work. So
and shake your fist at me.
Yeah, exactly. Shusterman. But like I said, Game Changer is out in the world now. I heard some buzz about potential adaptation, or is there something in the works as far as that goes?
Yeah, it's with Netflix right now, and they're developing it as a TV series, and I'm co-writing the pilot with Brian Yorkie, who, among other things, wrote my favorite Broadway musical, Next to Normal, which is about mental illness. So to be working with someone who, I basically idolize for that piece of literature, it's really fantastic. It's really a fun process writing with him.
Well, that is an exciting next step for all this stuff. So again, people should be following you in all those places to hear where that's going. Game Changer is out now. Get your hands on it. And Neal, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
You're very welcome.